Well, you got $1 million back, remember, when you were old. Okay. Exactly. So that's the whole point. The point is that the dollar paid, so just to repeat what he said, the dollar, in case you couldn't hear it, the first daughter paid $1 million when she was young. Yes, she got the $1 million back, but when she was old, and that's a long time later. So for that whole time, she made a 0% interest. Now, maybe the interest rate was, let's say, over that many years, we're talking about 30 years or something, or 40 years, a large amount of time. So the interest rate could easily, if 40 years, you divide 40 into 72, it's like 1 3/4 or something. So if the real interest rate was 1 3/4, something like that, you could easily imagine that that was the doubling rule, that $100 could have been turned into $200. So the first daughter who took her $100 could have had $200 by the time she was old. She only got $100 when she was old. So in present value terms, she gave up $100 when she was young. She got, in present value terms, $50 when she was old. So she gave away $50. She paid for half the operation. Now, where did the rest of the $50 come from? Well, the granddaughter gave $100 when she was young, got $100 when she was old. So in present value terms, she also lost $50, exactly the same amount as the first daughter. She gave up the same thing. Her contribution was just as big. Of course, it came a lot later. So in present value terms, at the time of the operation, the granddaughter's contribution is discounted twice. So it's a half of a half. So she only contributed, in present value terms, $25 to the operation. And then the great-granddaughter, she herself looks at it as a $50 contribution, but from the point of view of the original operation, it's discounted 3 times, so by 8, so it's 12 and a half. So 50 plus 25 plus 12 and a half plus 6 1/4, blah, 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 forever, adds up to the 100. So basically, this parable shows how a daughter could share the cost of her mother's operation among all the descendants, pay completely for the operation, with each generation making the same contribution, the same sacrifice. Of course, the generations who make it earlier are helping the mother more, but the point is every generation has made exactly the same sacrifice and paid for, and that's how the original mother's operation got paid for. Okay, now, what happens in generation 10? The great-great-great-great-great-great-granddaughter is going to say, I never even heard of this original mother. I couldn't care less about her operation. It wasn't a very good operation anyway, because she died 3 years later because medicine was so bad at the time. So, why should I be paying my contribution to that original mother's operation? Yes, I know that she's responsible for my life, but, I don't know anything about her. I don't even know her name anymore. How come I have to keep paying for it? So I just want to stop. Now, why is it going to be actually difficult for that generation to stop? I just don't want to give my money to that first generation. I couldn't care less. Let's stop right now. Yep.
She's not giving the money to the great-great-grandmother. She's giving it to
her own mother. Exactly. So you can't stop just in the middle, because it's like the gift is being reenacted every generation. So the new generation that stops, even if they understand where the whole thing began, they're not going to screw the original mother. They're going to screw their own mother, which they probably don't want to do. So they're not going to want to stop the thing. Okay, so that's what. Okay, so to say the parable very shortly, the first generation that got taxes. Got benefits without contributing anything, that was a huge amount of money that they got. Every generation after that lost money, but that was all, a way to pay the first generation, and you can't stop the cycle without screwing your own parents. And so it's very difficult for the thing to be stopped. Okay, so now you could make it a little bit more realistic by saying every generation, the interest rate, there's a growth, wages grow every generation, say between 1 and 2% in real terms. That's the historical rate of growth. By the way, it hasn't been so great lately, but anyway, historically, say 1 to 2% real growth of wages. So on an annualized basis, if you did the same thing with each generation paying 12% of their youthful wages, you would find that, now we're coming closer to reality, that every generation was going to get between 1 and 2% return on their contributions, because the young would contribute $12 out of 100, say, but their daughter, that lady's daughter, 30 years later, the wages would have grown by 1 to 2% every year for those 30 years. So 12% of that bigger number would go to that daughter, and so there would be a rate of return between 1 and 2%. And that's exactly what Bush and everybody else is predicting. So now you understand where the 1 to 2% comes from that you're going to get. If the population is stable, the ratio of young to old, the rate of return on Social Security is going to be equal to the rate of growth of wages. So it's not 0, as in the first parable, because wages are actually growing. It's between 1 and 2%, which is a bad return compared to the rate of interest. And that's why every generation is losing. Okay, so let's do one more thing. So the baby boom. Does the baby boom make things worse or better? Okay, so how can you think about it? See, this is so simple-minded to think this way. It's amazing the public is so confused about this. So suppose you have a baby boom generation. So you're going on with all these mothers. We're back to the mother and the daughter with 1 million. And so let's say there's one mother, one daughter, one person in every generation. All of a sudden, there's a baby boom generation. But of course, to be old, you have to be young first. So let's say in some generation, after a bunch of times, there are 2 daughters instead of 1 daughter. They're each paying, there are 2 daughters instead of 1 daughter. So each of them is now going to pay, if the tax rate stays the same, and the young daughters now each pay 1, the mother who's alive then only needs 1 when she gets old. So two daughters now have 1 to contribute. So half of their money goes to paying off the mother when she's old, just like it would have usually happened. But the baby generation, because it's young first, that means when I was young, my generation was making a huge amount of money, paying a huge. We're doing it now. That's why there's this surplus. There's this gigantic surplus being put into Social Security. And so when my generation gets old, the dollar that didn't have to go to the mother because there was an extra dollar there, that could be earning the rate of interest. And so at the end, when we get old, there are going to be 2 of us, and there's only going to be 1 child next generation to contribute 1, and we're going to be expecting 2. But see, the 1 that was put in when we were young has now grown to 2. So you've got 2 there plus another 1, that's 3. So there actually should be a surplus, not a deficit. Did you follow that? Did that go too fast? So I'm saying that, every generation, you give 1, you get 1. You give 1, you get 1. You give 1, you get 1. All of a sudden, there are 2 people, so they're each giving 1, so none of them is worse off than before. When they get old, they're going to need 2, and you've only got 1 person contributing. So here's the baby boom, double the size of all the other generations. So, but, when they're old, it looks like a problem. Who's going to take care of these people? There are not enough young people to take care of them. But remember, they were young before they were old. So since this mother only needs 1, and there are 2 of these daughters, the extra 1 could be invested, and the 1 that's invested is going to make a rate of return and become more than 1, like close to 2. And so you'll have the 1 from the new daughter plus almost 2 from that was, saved and earned up, that's in the Social Security Trust Fund and earning interest. So you'll actually have $3 to make up for the 2, and so it's not a problem at all that you had this baby boom. In fact, it's a benefit that we had the baby boom. So basically, what did the baby boom do? It staved off the original problem. So let's just think about this one more time. Suppose that you have a slightly more realistic example, the kind you're going to do in the problem set. So suppose that you've got people live from 20 to 80, and they pay taxes and work from 20 to 60, and they retire from 60 to 80. Okay, and everybody's paying $12 in Social Security taxes when working, and there's a 0 rate of interest, and they're getting 24. Well, maybe I have a rate of interest. They're getting $24 when they're retired in benefits. Okay, so the system balances every year because in every generation. So these are the birth years. The thing started, in 1938, and then they collected taxes for a little while, and then Francis Perkins got in action, and so they decided to go to pay-as-you-go. So let's just assume it started pay-as-you-go from the very beginning. So in 1940, so you see in 1940, the people who are 60, the 1880 generation, would have 2 decades to live. So these guys Oh, I'm sorry, I never put this, not that it mattered, but would have been a little better. So these guys, you know, the 60-year-olds and the 60-year-olds here, and these 70-year-olds, the 70-year-olds and the 60-year-olds are collecting money. Now, the original start of Social Security was a little fuzzy. They didn't want to pay people who had never contributed, but so these 70-year-olds weren't really getting anything. But okay, let's just keep for the simple steady state. So the point is, the 60-year-olds are collecting $24. The 70-year-olds are collecting $24, and each of these generations, the 50, 40, 30s, and 20s, they're all paying $12. So the contributions are exactly matching the benefits. So the system is perfectly in balance. Okay, now what happens the next decade? You've got the new 70-year-olds. It's this next generation, plus these guys who have now turned 70, okay, who had been contributing before. Now they're in their 60s. Sorry, they're in their 60s. These guys are in their 70s. These guys are in their 60s. And then here are the contributors. This new generation has now come on board to contribute. So again, there's balance every generation. Okay, but now who are the winners and the losers? Well, you know, it's much worse than it sounded at first glance because people live longer than 1 year. So you see, these people from the 40s, all these guys were gaining. So this generation of 1870s, they have almost an infinite rate of return. They made no contributions. Okay, these guys, they also made no contributions, and they're getting huge returns because they're getting them, you know, 20 years of returns. But it's worse than that, because when we go to the next generation, these guys, they actually contributed when they were in their 50s, but that wasn't very long before they retired, and they got, you know, they got $24 of benefits, and $24 of benefits having only paid $12 of taxes. And of course, this came later, but 48 compared to 12, they got a gigantic rate of return. Well, you go to the next generation, and they're making out like bandits too, because they only contributed twice. Okay, so in the 40s, a bunch of people were making money, getting benefits who didn't make any contributions. In the 50s, a bunch of people were getting benefits who made no contributions. In the 60s, there's still people getting benefits who made no contributions. It's not till you get to the 70s, 40 years, or the 80s, what am I talking about? The 80s, once people are fully retired, you know, have made 40 years of contribution. So from 40 to 80, it's not until the 80s that the people who are getting benefits were all people who fully contributed. Okay, so all these people were getting an incredibly good deal. We had 40 years of people getting, you know, extra returns. So if you just do the distributive law of arithmetic and you realize that although these things go off to infinity because they're discounted, you can sum them in either direction. You can sum down the columns, okay, and that's always zero. The benefits and the contributions always net to zero. But therefore, if you add up the rows, which is what each generation gets, they also have to add up to zero. But you see, there's so many original generations. This one got a huge benefit. This one got huge benefits. The present value of their contributions relative to their benefits is incredibly positive for that generation. For this generation, it's still incredibly positive. Remember, this is 12-12, and this is 24-24. For this generation, it's probably still positive. Not till you get to here has it become, you know, well, not till you get to here does something change. So this is a positive number, this is a big positive number, this is a gigantic positive number, and this is a huge positive number. You add up over all these things positives. The rest of these generations have to be negative to just balance the thing at zero. So that's why every generation from here down to here is going to have to earn a negative return. Basically, in steady state, they'd all earn the same negative present value or the same bad rate of return. And there were so many generations that got positive amounts of money. So in today's dollars, can you tell me how much money that we gave away to these early generations? Can you take a guess? Just order of magnitude. So I'm asking in today's dollars, in today's present value dollars. So whatever the number is, you have to assume it grew at the rate of interest since then. So what do you think that is? A couple trillion. Does someone want to guess? It's a reasonable guess, but someone want to make another guess? Just so you get an idea of the size of the program. Does anyone know what GNP is in the country? Okay, 14 trillion, something like that is GNP. So what do you guess this number is? Okay, it's 17 trillion. So he guessed 2 trillion. It's 17 trillion. So we made a staggering transfer of income to these people at the beginning, and now somebody's got to pay for that. And it's not a trivial thing to pay for, because 17 trillion, if everybody gave, every corporation, every person in the whole country gave away all the money they made for a year, we still wouldn't pay it down. Okay? So that's a big amount that's hanging over everybody. Okay? And that's what the Social Security problem is. We gave away so much money at the beginning. If we keep the system in balance, we have to gradually give all the money back. And we can't stop it, because then some old guys are going to get screwed. So there's no way of stopping the thing. And each generation has to lose. So the reason why you're getting such low rates of return is because the system was designed. Frances Perkins knew what she was doing. She wanted to help all those old people in the 40s. Now, she was out of power in the 50s and 60s, when we were still helping all those people. But the point is, it was a tremendous transfer of wealth to the retired generations of that era, and that's the reason why everybody's getting such a bad rate of return now. It's not because the money's being lost or thrown away. Okay, so what I'm telling you now is not controversial. I don't think many people understand it, but it's, everyone who does understand it agrees with it. When we come to my solution, they're not going to agree. But anyway, so what I'm telling you, so just to compute, so in the problem set, you have to compute an example. So let's just see how this would work. So suppose, from the point of view of a 10-year-old, just doing the example I did, suppose there's a 15% rate of interest, and you're going to contribute in your $12 in your, so no growth in the economy, so it's $12 all the time when you're in your 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. Okay, so what would you do from the point of view of age 10, that's 10 years before your 20s, you're going to contribute $12 in your 20s, you discount it at the 15% rate of interest. You're going to be doing, contributing $12 in your 30s, so you discount it at 15% twice. In your 40s, you're giving up $12. You're discounting it to 15% 3 times, and in your 50s, you're doing it $12. You're discounting it 4 times. So that's the present value of what you've, from the point of view of a child, a young girl looking at what you're going to be forced to contribute over your life. Those are the taxes you can expect to pay in present value terms. Now, of course, when you get old, in your 60s and 70s, you're going to get you can get benefits, $24, much higher than the taxes you paid. But by then, it's 5 decades later, so you're discounting it 5 times. And when you're in your 70s, you're discounting it 6 times. So you have to divide, discount by 6. And so the present value of that is way less than the present value of this. So you see that the loss in present value terms is going to be $11 out of 34, which is what your benefits were. So your loss is something like 34%. So this is just, I just made up these numbers. The actual loss, which I computed for the real economy, is around 25%. So that's how big each generation, a quarter of the typical, so here it's 34%, a quarter to a third, in this example, of each generation's Social Security taxes are simply being lost, frittered away, and handed, basically used to pay off the debt from the original generation. Okay? Now, if you want to look at the total present value loss starting in the 1930s, you have to, for people born in the 1930s, okay, you have to look at, every generation's losing the same 1195, and so you take the infinite future of generations, and they're losing 7968 if you add up to infinity, and of course that's the gain that was given to the original generations. Okay, so that's the kind of example you're going to work out, except for with realistic numbers. Okay, and so I just do, but you're going to do that anyway. All right, so that's it. So now, if you look at which generations got the most money, at the beginning there weren't many people in Social Security, and so the amount of money that they got, the benefits the really old got, there were so few of them that if you add it up, it wasn't that big. But so the generation that benefited the most was my father's generation and James Tobin's generation. And Tobin, as we'll see in a second, he used to tell me all the time, so he was Yale's most famous economist, And I happen to be the James Tobin professor, so I have quite a fondness for him. And he also went to the same high school he went to in Illinois. Anyway, he used to tell me that the problem with Social Security was we didn't have enough, I didn't have enough children. And I would tell him the problem with Social Security was we gave him, his birth date, too much money. And that's why we're all suffering now. So you can see all the generations and which generation got the most amount of money. So that also calculated. Okay, so now this parable is not exactly accurate. So by the way, in the parable we should have had a crisis in 1970. It should have been, or 1980. I told you the people in 1980 should already have realized, the generation starting to work in 1980, so born in 1960, a lot younger than you are, they should already have realized that they were getting a bad deal in Social Security. And so we should have had all this come much sooner. So what kept the problem from manifesting itself until now? Well, what kept the problem from manifesting itself till now is actually quite easy to see. Is there were a lot more young people per old in the historical generations, and now we're leveling off, and everybody thinks there are going to be 2 young people for every old. The story I sort of told, working from 40 to 60 and retired from 60 to 80 in a stable population, that's coming close to what we're converging to. So they're going to be 2 young for every old, where there used to be 3, 4, and 5. Now, how could there have been so many young for all the old? Well, women at the beginning were in this period, they were working. Women were surging into the labor force. There was a huge number of young women working, but their mothers actually weren't working. They had not worked, and so they were getting half their husband's benefits, not the full benefit that these daughters who are working their whole lives are going to get. They're not going to take half their husband's benefits. They're going to take all their own benefits, which are going to be a lot higher. So, then there was the baby boom generation. The baby boom generation, far from causing the problem, has deferred the problem. There are all these surpluses because we were working so long. Okay, so I don't want to get into all the details. People are living longer now, too, so that's another problem. Okay, so too much complication here. Okay, so what can you do about this? Well, there's obvious things to do, which are bad. So one thing you could do is you could say, well, if we're supposed to be paying the average young person 40% of the new generation's wages, and there are only going to be 2 young people for every old person, we could maybe shave the 40% down a little bit. Let's make the Social Security tax 18% instead of 12%. So you could raise it by 6%. Okay, that would be a shocking. Okay, so I think that nobody wants to actually do that because an increase of 6% in the tax rate is an astronomical increase, and you can read in the newspapers how loath Congress is to raising taxes. Okay, another obvious thing you could do is you could reduce raise retirement age. So instead of saying it's 65 because people will live, till 80, make it start at 67. So you only have to pay them, for 13 years instead of 15 years. In this example, 18 years instead of 20 years. So you could keep raising the retirement age. The problem with that is, not the retirement age, the age you start collecting Social Security. The problem with that, of course, is that people are retiring not later and later, even younger and younger, believe it or not. And so you're getting this huge gap between when people retire and when they start getting Social Security. So there's a limit to so obviously you should do a little bit of that, but there's a limit of how much of that you can do. So you need to make not just a parametric reform, like adjusting a number, changing the tax rate a little bit, but I believe you need a fundamental reform. And the Republicans have proposed one. They've said, let's privatize. Let's change the whole system. Okay, so so what does it mean to privatize? How are they going to do that? So what Bush had in mind was the following. He said, what is privatization? It involves 3 things. It's the creation of individual accounts, so your name goes on it. So it's your account, your money, and no one can take it from you. It's your money, and your money is what's going to pay for your own benefits, so it's pre-funded. Okay, so it's individual accounts and pre-funded, and it's diversification. You're supposed to invest not just in government bonds, but in the stock market, whatever else you want. So those are the three cornerstones of at least the way I've explained them, of privatization. Three things it accomplishes. It gives you your name on the money. It's your money. That's the money that's going to pay you when you get old, pre-funding. And you can invest in a wider range of assets, especially the stock market, which is what everybody seems to want to put their money in, or at least used to until we had this last crash. On the other hand, the stock market's going up a lot, so people are getting less nervous about it. So those things are different. They're not the same. Okay, so now how is Bush going to handle this? So how would you think he was going to do this? How can you possibly say, so Bush said, I want to privatize, I want the 12% that you pay in Social Security taxes, I want 4% of that for you to be able to put that in your private account in the stock market with your name on it. Okay, so Gore said, well, that's ridiculous. If it's only 8% then left to give to the old people are going to get cheated. So how is Bush going to handle that? What do you think he was going to do? Could you say that again? Sounds right, but I couldn't see. Okay, exactly. So, I mean, I don't know what Gore was thinking, especially since I was supposedly advising Gore about Social Security. But he just said in the debate, that's impossible. You'll just screw all the old people. So, okay, so you're supposed to be giving 12%, 12 here, minus 12 here, and then getting some return over here. And now Bush is saying, I only want to give you $8, and the other 4 you put in your Social Security account, and then you're going to get maybe a much bigger return here, because in your stock market account in Social Security, so you can't take it out. So Bush would say, yes, let people put their names on it, force them to save and contribute the whole $12. Bush agrees that you got to force young people to save because they're not going to do it otherwise. So you put the $4 in their private account, but it's their name on it, and then it grows to some huge number, 20, instead of just doubling by the time they get old. And so that huge account is their money. So that's what Bush would say. So Gore would say, well, if you take these $4 and give it to them, how are you going to pay the old people who need the 12 right up here? The old people are supposed to get 12. How are you going to give them their 12 when the young aren't handing over the 12 anymore? They're only handing over 8. Well, it's not like Bush and his advisors didn't think about that. That would be a colossal blunder. Of course they thought about that. So what were they going to do? They were going to have the government go out and borrow the other 4. So the government contributes 4 that it borrows. And now, of course, over here, the government's going to have to owe 8 because it's got to pay back the 4 it owed, in 30 years. We're assuming 100% interest over 30 years. It's got to pay back the 8. You're all with me. So where are they going to get the 8? Who are they going to get the 8 from? What?
Taxpayers.
Which taxpayer?
All of them.
Everybody. Really?
The same people who are paying the Social Security.
Okay, these people. So if you chose to take 4 of your dollars out of Social Security and put it into your Social Security stock market trust fund, your personal trust fund, the deal is you have to pay the interest at the end of 30 years. So this 8 comes out of your 20. Okay, so the government, so these people pay back the 8. So basically, to say it in a different way, the way you get to invest in the stock market, according to the Bush privatization rules, is these people effectively, they're giving the $12 anyway to the old, but they get to borrow $4 and put it in their private stock market account, and then they have to pay back the amount they borrowed with interest, which is 8. But if the stock market does better than the interest rate, then of course they make out better. They get 20 minus 8, which is 12. Okay, so is that clear how he did it? So it's not a logical impossibility. The problem with the Bush plan, of course, is that if the money you put in the stock market earns the same rate of return that you would have gotten anyway, if the stock market earns the same rate of return, 100% over all those years as the bond market, then this private stash you have just goes back to paying off the government debt, and you haven't gained anything in the stock market. You get the same Social Security benefits you would have had anyway. So these guys who opt into the privatization program, let me repeat the Bush plan, if you opt into the privatization program, you effectively do everything you did before in Social Security. You pay your taxes that go to the old people, you get the benefits just like you did before, but on top of it you have the right to borrow $4 from the government, invest it in stocks, and then at the end you have to pay back the government out of your stock market return. So you're betting on whether the stock market is going to do better than the bond market. That's effectively what the plan was. Okay? So it's not a logical impossibility like Gore said. On the other hand, if you don't think the stock market's going to do better than the bond market, you could end up being worse off. You could put in $4 here, get only $6, and then you'd have to owe the government $8. Where is the government going to get the other $2 from? It's going to reduce your Social Security contributions by 2. So that's the government plan. Okay, so in the problem set, I gave you 3 problems. You can only do 2 of them now. The last one I didn't get far enough to have you do, so just do 2 of them. And I'm going to give my own plan next time and also do a little mathematics. It's going to turn out that it's quite interesting to math this up a little bit.